Today, I had the privilege of talking with author and YouTuber Carroll Wainright. That is his pen name as a writer, but he is better known here on YouTube as the Falcon Reads, a fantastic book reviewer. And being an admirer of his channel for some time, I asked him if he'd like to come on my channel to talk about a book that has inspired him greatly or impacted him greatly. And the book that he chose was Cormac McCarthy's final novel, The Passenger. And let me just tell you, he was a great choice. He was the right choice to bring on here to talk about that book because he has an intimate knowledge of all of Cormac McCarthy's works, but also an intimate knowledge of science and philosophy, two subjects that go hand in hand with Cormac McCarthy's works. And he also came out with a new book called The Unbearable Heaviness of Being or Life Reviled, a book that I'm going to have him back on the channel to have a conversation about once I get a chance to finish it, which will be very soon, hopefully. And I've read the first chapter, and let me just tell you that everything he has said about it so far is true. I'm going to drop the link to the book as well as his channel down in the description below. I highly encourage you to check out his work. All right, without further ado, here is my conversation with Carroll Wainright about Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger. Hey everybody, I am here with another one of these videos where I talk to somebody who has found a book that has been particularly impactful to them. And today I have the honor of speaking with Carroll from the Falcon Reads channel. How's it going, man? I'm so happy you decided to take me up on this offer.
It is going good. Thank you for the offer.
Yeah, of course. So today we're going to be talking about, as shown by the overlay here, The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy. It's a book I've read. It's a book you've read. Clearly, that's why we're here. And it's definitely had an influence on you. I think on your review you mentioned it was it your favorite book of all time or your favorite Cormac McCarthy book?
Second favorite book of all time, but it is my favorite of his now.
Okay, great. And I guess before we get into The Passenger, I'd like to talk about Cormac McCarthy a little bit because we lost him recently, and he was a terrible loss
Yes.
to the world of literature. But you made a video showcasing your your giant stack of books of all of his. So presumably you've read every single one of his works. And
I read every single one of his novels. The plays and screenplays I had not, but yes, all of his novels I have. And I think Passenger surpassed all of them in my not so humble opinion, at least.
yeah, it was definitely a great one. And I'm assuming you have the hardback companion, the Stella Maris and The
I do. I've
Passenger.
got the
Yeah,
box set with the atom bomb explosion. Quite germane with the Oppenheimer movie out, It
I know it
fits.
is. Totally. All right, well, let's start talking about The Passenger then. I guess what makes this book so special to you? Like in
Well, when it came out, alas, the reviews were rather lukewarm, I found, which was, kind of sad to me because I just found it personally to surpass everything else he had done. Not in terms of perfection, I'll say. As I've said before, I don't think it's his most perfect work because it's very unwieldy. And you really get the sense that he was trying to just cram a lot of stuff into it. But it is because of its reach that I truly do feel that it has superseded the entirety of his other body of work because I don't think there are very many books that you can see a writer just so going for broke with that. He was really trying to pull in, I think, such a broad, you know, view of human existence, and it was a heck of a ride. It didn't make sense all the time with the plot because I know everybody, kind of shat on it a little bit because of the conspiracy at the heart that it sets up in like the first couple chapters and then just never comes back to. But it wasn't. I knew going in it was never going to be that way, so I wasn't particularly disappointed with that. But the characters I found were probably the best that he had ever written, and some of those scenes really went right for the heart, and also the intellectual aspect of it was. I still think about it all the time. All the time, I still think about it. So yeah, I think it has just the most in it. It's the most to the max.
I guess on that note, do you think that he was aware that this was probably his last book or a pair of books?
Well, hindsight's 2020 and all. And sadly, none of us knew that he only had like 8 more months to go before he passed tragically. But I really I knew that this was probably going to be the last hurrah. I mean, 2006 was the last year that he had published a book, so I think we were all, and probably he was as well, anticipating this to be the last outing. But I think he killed it. I think he went out absolutely on top.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier when you were kind of giving me the background on why this book is so special to you, that some of the stuff really hits you in the heart. Can you think of the definitive moment when you were reading The Passenger where you're like, okay, this is it. This is like the top.
The scene that cemented it for me as being my favorite book of his was the scene where Bobby, the main character, goes back to visit I guess it's his grandmother's farm in Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
because his books have a tendency to revert back to Tennessee at some point. And that entire homecoming sequence was just sheer desolation. I don't think I've ever seen something so desolating as that sequence in that book when he went back home and then he's just grappling with, the loss of his sister, and that he rather, how should I say, not approved, was in love with. But that's also power of the book, is that it managed to make something that most people would, think of as grotesque into something
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. But that whole homecoming section, just that sealed it for me. That's what did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was probably my favorite part too. Just his
Most
uncle.
character building there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. But speaking of the incest aspect that you brought up, I think that's a good segue to talk about that portion. So I found the same thing. So when you're reading about it, he presented it in such a way that isn't grotesque, as you say, this
Yeah.
very taboo thing, to where you felt like there was just this genuine love between these two people,
Mm.
and the fact that they are siblings really is the only thing getting in the way of it. And I guess how how did you when it first came to be? Because I think it sort of was like you didn't quite get what was going on in the beginning. I think she was talking about her love because the beginning of the chapters where you were kind of in her head, talking to the Thamalidite kid and all that. Were you like, oh shit, this is, was it the obvious part of it, or did it kind of just worm its way into your skin to where you had this revelation of that's what this is?
Well, I think the Bobby's there's other characters that hang around the bar place where he frequents that talk about it at the beginning, and they set it up to be like some kind of carnal thing where it kind of fakes you out, like, oh, it was actually just
Yeah.
something lustful, but then you realize it was actually more platonic than it was physical. But he's done the incest thing in the past with Outer Dark, and it was way more grotesque and kind of condemned in that book. Whereas in this book, it was much more positively portrayed. But yeah, and it goes deeper in the companion piece, Stella Maris. It
Mm-hmm.
goes way deeper into the romantic aspect of it. But yeah, you can see pretty early on where it's going, but I mean, hell, I live in Arkansas. Incest it's no big deal where where I live.
So you're
These
right at
genes
home
are
with
held
Cormac
together with
McCarthy.
super glue.
That's funny. I guess, what do you think the purpose of that was? What do you think McCarthy was trying to explore with that relationship?
Well, I think it was kind of meant to be more like a first pair kind of neo Adam and Eve thing, kind of, because their
Okay.
dad, is a fictitious character that McCarthy had inserted into the real life Manhattan Project, and you get the sense of them living in the shadow of the thing that could possibly destroy the world. That's a tool of utter destruction, and they're both grappling with that, and so kind of they live an isolated childhood in the backwoods of Tennessee, kind of a rural backwoods Eden kind of. And so I think it was kind of meant to be like they're the children of a dark dangerous god or something like that. I may be reaching, but I don't know.
No, no, that's a good observation. Um, I read somewhere that this novel was he first started writing it like in the 80s or something. Is that right?
Yeah.
So one thing
Yeah.
I'd go ahead.
Oh, no, go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. One thing I was that's really surprised me is the youthful voice it had, and just kind of the
Yeah.
out there nature of it in terms of um, his sister's story. Like in the beginning of each chapter, for I don't know, maybe halfway, I can't remember. Um, it was just the most out there zany McCarthy I've ever seen. Like,
Indeed.
do you think that is kind of a product of his youth, or not youth, but that long ago, or do you think it was just he was able to capture that voice even at his ripe old age of 89?
Well, I think there are some authors that have a real ear for youth, even in their old age. Like Stephen King, up until pretty recently, has been pretty good at portraying children, teenagers, adolescents very well. I think McCarthy was like that. If you read like the Border trilogy, he's pretty good at portraying a realistic voice of youth. But he did start writing this in the '80s, and that's why none of his books are set contemporaneously because, well, except the road, but that's in the future. But because he starts writing them and it takes him like 20 years to write it. Like Suttree is set in the 1950s, but it was published in the 1970s because that's when he started writing it. Was in the 1950s. But I think what he's probably started out writing was much different than what we got because he only became a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute within like the last 15 or so years, and that's where he got all the physics aspects of it that he just crammed into it. And plus, I think you could make a real argument that this book is probably anachronistic because I don't believe that the level of scientific knowledge that is on display in the book was actually available in 1980 when the book is set. So I think there may be some element of anachronism there, but who cares? That's minutia. It works. But I think the conspiracy thriller is probably what he really initially started out to write, and then when he started getting more interested in science and physics and mathematics, he just was like, well, we'll hook them with this, but you come for the conspiracy but stay for the physics. So I think he probably altered it quite a bit from what it originally was meant to be, probably.
Yeah, that's a good thing to notice is that I didn't think about it in that context. I also didn't think about it in the context of that the science might not be accurate for the time period. But to
I
think of,
doubt it is.
but to think like how, like you said, he was kind of writing more of a No Country for Old Men style story early on. That's what he wanted to do. But then his fascination with the sciences, mathematics and physics and all that, took over the story. And it's interesting to think about that he didn't scrap the beginning. He kind of kept it. And then the plot, like you mentioned earlier, is kind of strange. On one hand, you feel like, okay, who are these guys coming to see Bobby Western? What's going on? And then it just goes nowhere. And I could be looking too far into it, but really what I got out of this book was that real life is not a well plotted story.
No.
That those kind of my, for all of the critics out there talking about how the plot fell apart or there is no plot. Bobby Western just kind of wanders off into the sunset essentially, and just nothing really comes of his story that much. And that's what I got out of it. Did you get anything else out of it or?
Well, I think the way that the narrative kind of dissolves is kind of a reflection of the themes of the book. It's thematic material because in the background of the book, you have the nuclear guilt that they're living under from their dad's contribution to the atomic bomb. And, the atomic bomb, I don't know much about nuclear physics, but it involves the splitting of an atom, of destroying the smallest component of reality. And also, a big part of the book, I think, is entropy, of the dissolution physically into nothingness, and that's why I think that, because the story starts out seemingly tightly plotted, like it has a clear sense of direction, but as it goes on, it just unravels into nothing, basically. I think that was kind of just an intentional reflection of the themes that the book was dealing with, that it's about things ending, it's about things coming undone and decaying, in other words.
Yeah, that's a much better answer than mine. I like that. I like that because it
I
definitely
try.
it definitely weaves in the scientific elements into it, so it doesn't feel so just, hey, what the hell happened kind of thing. So what are some other impactful scenes to you? What are some other memorable scenes that really stuck out to you?
Well, there's a scene towards the end of the book where Bobby encounters the thalidomide kid and his dead sister's hallucination in real life. And I found that incredibly striking and incredibly telling as well, because of what it was really dealing with. Because McCarthy's books, there's always that slight mystical element, but it can go both ways. Like if you've read Blood Meridian, you may know that the villain in the book may be like Satan himself, or maybe he's not. It's ambiguous, but that was not ambiguous in this one. He really went there into the explicit supernaturalism of it, and I like that because throughout the book there's a lot of discussion, or at least a lot of thought given to the unconscious mind, because it ties into an essay, the only nonfiction piece I think that McCarthy ever wrote, which was called the Kekulé problem, which is about the development of language and the role of the unconscious mind. And I think McCarthy is kind of subtly saying that the unconscious mind is a link to something much older, because it's odd, because there's a part of us as people, that we don't even understand. I mean, we don't even understand ourselves. We have a half of our mind is awake, and perceives sensory data and recreates a simulation of the world. But then there's another half, like when we dream and everything, it's just completely beyond our knowledge. We don't know why we dream. We don't know so much about our own minds, about uh, the way that we even exist. And I really liked that scene at the end where it explicitly went into the supernatural, inarguably too, because I really do think he's saying that there is some kind of link to something else. And McCarthy, I think that The Passenger and Stella Maris in particular are probably the most transparent things that McCarthy has ever written, in that they kind of reveal some things that he really believed about life and about human existence. And I think it was nowhere more apparent than in that scene right there, that there's something in us as people which may be tied to something beyond ourselves, something like that.
That's a great answer. I totally have to agree with that. It kind of came out of nowhere, and it was a very beautiful sequence where we were kind of linking him back to his sister.
Yes.
With that. So I really enjoyed that. I just thought the atmosphere, the setting, everything about that scene was, you really felt it. And I think, with the exception of maybe The Road, was also a very feelsy kind of book for me. The Passenger, I really did feel it too. Like it was really, like you said, I don't feel like Cormac McCarthy. It's so strange to me to think that he wrote this at the end of his life, and it feels like the exact kind of book someone's going to write at the end of their life.
Yeah.
And just
yes, it's an ending of a book. Yes.
yeah, just to nail that so well is insane. And have you read it again, or have you just read it once?
I've not read it again. I didn't want to rush right back into it again. I wanted to kind of like, cogitate on it enough and then revisit it maybe like towards the end of this year, maybe give it a little bit time to see if it's still what I feel like it is going back into it. So not yet, but one day.
Yeah, I really want to get back to it at some point too, because it's one that is begging to be reread. And I know when I got to the end of Stella Maris, I was like, I need to go back to the beginning again. And speaking of that, I think we can talk about Stella Maris too, because it's a companion book. It's not a sequel. It documents, her time at the mental institution, and it's really just a long conversation between
Yeah, it's like
her
a
and the
Socratic dialogue.
yeah, yeah. And that's what was interesting to me, is that a lot of times in novels, you get everything you need out of the singular novel. What do you think? But what do you think Cormac McCarthy was trying to do with this odd companion piece? Do you think it's something that he felt needed to be separate? Do you think it was a publisher pressure to release 2 volumes and he wanted to keep it all in one like massive book? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it maybe was a publisher's decision to split it up like it was, but I think Stella Maris is the one. There's very little actual like story in that, and I think that's the one where he was just really trying to just talk, arguing with himself, basically just trying to talk about all the stuff that he wanted to talk about. And I think it's an excellent companion piece. Not as narratively strong as The Passenger, I'd say. It didn't hit me quite as hard, although it did. It's incredibly intellectually stimulating. It's nothing but food for thought, basically, start to finish.
I know. You really get a sense of who Alicia is in that book. I think
Yeah,
more so than The Passenger, and so it was a necessity. I'd be curious to know what he wanted to do with it. Like if it was literally a an appendix, for lack of a better term, like a
yeah.
secondary part two to The Passenger, or if it was kind of interspersed, like he was doing the little prelude bits in the chapters and all the italics with Alicia. I'd be really curious to see how he would have formatted it, or if in fact this is what he wanted to do. I have no idea. One thing that really got me thinking about this is I mentioned it in my review, but there's a book called The Believing Brain by Michael Shermer. And I don't know if you know who he is, but he interviews a lot of great minds. He writes books on his own. He's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, where he talks about skepticism. He talks about that book completely fascinated me because he was mentioning how genius and madness are just
Hand in hand.
hand in hand.
Yeah.
And that really got me thinking. I don't think if I had not had read that book, I don't think I'd have the same impression that I got from The Pastor and Stella Maris, where Stella Maris is like just too big for this world, the way
Yeah.
she thinks and the way she sees the world. And it makes me wonder if that contributed to her love for her brother, because she kind of existed almost beyond these biological boundaries of taboo. And
Yeah.
so she could see that relationship very differently, because in the book, she was the one that was pushing it. He
Mm.
was very resistant,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, what do you think about that? Like, in terms of, do you think that her just absolute genius was crucial to their relationship in that regard?
Yeah, because I think it's kind of stated in that one that he's the only one that can even kind of understand her, because she's quite literally the most intelligent person that's ever lived. She can't even be measured, it says in the book. And it's funny because it's logically impossible for an author to write a character whose intelligence exceeds their own. But I think he did a damn fine job of faking it out, because I mean you get the sense that this is like truly immeasurable intelligence, but that he avoids having to actually go there. But it works out very well. But yeah, I think they're kind of like clinging to each other because they're both, incredibly intelligent. She especially, and there's just very little besides each other that they can really connect with.
Yeah. So these these cohorts of hers, what do you think that was all about? Like, what was?
I think in Stella Maris, I think that's where he really got explicit with some of his beliefs. It's kind of implied that they are sent by something. There's a mention of an entity which she refers to in the book as the Archatron. That's interesting, or it was to me, because that harkens back to a previous book of his where he had used that exact word, and that's a fictitious word he just made up. That's not actually a real word. There's the word archon, which is I think what that book is drawn. That word is drawn from. But in Stella Maris, she mentions having like a vision of seeing, something beyond, so to speak, that she wasn't meant to see, and that these hallucinations of hers, which aren't really hallucinations, because Bobby himself encounters one later on in The Passenger, that they're kind of sent, they're kind of emissaries of a higher power. And the word architron is, again, it's a word of his own invention, although it kind of evokes the word archon, which is a term from Gnostic theology. And there's been a lot of stuff written about McCarthy's work, whether it contains elements of Gnosticism and or not. And I wholeheartedly think that it does, because if you didn't know, McCarthy's favorite book is, or was, sorry, sadly was, Moby Dick, which is just absolutely a Gnostic gospel. It really is. It is about paltry mortals in war with a very angry, dark deity, which they try to defy. And I think I really do think that Stella Maris is showing a glimpse of what he kind of believes that there is. I think that he's saying that there is some kind of higher power, so to speak, behind things that we see, and that it may not be wholly benevolent or benevolent at all. If you want to read into it, considering that his favorite book was Moby Dick, which very dark theology in that book as well.
Yeah, I haven't got around to that one yet. I don't know if I ever will. We'll see. It just doesn't
It's
seem
worth it, but
as worth
it's
it.
not fun.
Yeah. So the thalidomide kid, Bobby Western seeing him later in the book. I guess I like what you're saying because it's not what I thought whatsoever. Because I
Oh,
viewed it
really?
as almost like a link, kind of revealing. Because Bobby was a smart guy too. I think that's
Mm,
one thing we shouldn't downplay as well.
absolutely.
Compared to his sister, of course, he wasn't quite that level of genius. But I don't know. I kind of looked at it as a link, a psychological link, to their madness almost in a way. But I really like what you're saying about how it's separated from an hallucination, like his sister saw it, to
Mm,
therefore, really hammer in the fact that no, these are real, in a way.
yeah.
But it's interesting because yeah, like I didn't take it that way. I was like, oh well, this is because they're siblings and he's super smart and maybe they share a bit of that insanity. Um,
Yeah, it's
but
that old sibling link kind of thing with the like twins have sometimes.
yeah, 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 for sure. So that's cool to think about. Um, I'm trying to think about other moments in the book that really stood out to me. It's funny that you mentioned though the visit to the grandmother's house because that to me was like the most impactful part of the book, which is strange to think about, but it really gave you a glimpse of his his familial life as opposed to this this almost thriller esque kind of story. When he steps away from that at a certain time. Um, I remember. Did you ever watch the interviews with him and Lawrence Krauss and
I did. I thought all of those interviews didn't go quite in the direction I would have taken it if I had been the interviewer, but they were fun. They were better than the Oprah interview at least.
yeah, that was it was funny because I remember Lawrence Krauss he did most of the talking, and Cormac
Yeah,
McCarthy is he's notorious for not really speaking much. When he was on the Oprah
yeah,
interview, he would answer things very plainly,
yeah.
and Lawrence Krauss really tried to steer the conversation more into the sciences for obvious reasons. I remember thinking it was hilarious how uh, he was telling the story or talking about the scene with Bobby and his grandmother, and he says that she's talking or he's talking or she's talking to him or he's talking to her, and Cormac McCarthy immediately interrupted him and said, no, 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 talking at him. That's a very
Yeah.
distinct, and that to
Uh,
me really illuminated just how much this man must pour over his own work, word by word, uh,
Ridiculous. Yeah.
just an insane amount. It's kind of mind blowing because I don't think any other writer that I know of anyway has that kind of care, which is exemplified by his his small bibliography. He doesn't have a ton of books for someone's been writing for so many years.
Yes, that's true. True.
Yeah, but I always found it interesting to see him in interviews, even though he was kind of just sinking into the couch there, fading
Yeah,
away.
bless his heart. He was getting on up there in that interview. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, But it was still cool to see him talk about the sciences, because that's one thing that really threw me for a loop on this one, is how deep it got into that. I was like, I've always been interested in the sciences, physics, and not so much mathematics, but to see
I'm
it
terrible at
really,
math.
yeah, to see it laid out here just in so much detail was kind of mind blowing. And I think that it's risky. Not that Cormac McCarthy gives a shit about what anybody cares, or what everybody cares, anybody thinks, is that he'll just going to write the story he wants to write. He's going to write it
Yeah.
how he wants to write it, and that's what it's going to be. What did you? So since you say you hate mathematics, do you have any interest in physics and stuff? Like, what was it about the conversations that happened in this book, or these two books, that really captivated you?
Oh, I don't hate mathematics. Mathematics hates me. I am not geared towards. I was actually a pretty good student throughout school and college in most other subjects except the math, and then I was remedial in that area. But I find it endlessly fascinating, and especially the physics aspects of it. But yes, that's where the real meat of the book for me lies, is in the scientific discussions of it. In particular, there's something that he said in the book, and I know that he actually backs this up. This is not one of those moments where it's like, well, you can't read the author into it. You can definitely, with these books more than any other in his bibliography, you can read him into it. And there's a point in the book, in The Passenger, where I don't even remember who Bobby was speaking to, but he said, that might have been Thunder, but he
Cool.
said, he's talking to some character about physics, and he says there is no such thing. I think I can quote it verbatim. He says there is no such thing as information in and of itself, independent of the apparatus necessary to its perception. There were no starry skies before the first sentient and ocular beings able to perceive them. Before that, all was darkness and void. That was really seared onto my brain because it I don't think he ever mentions John Wheeler by name in The Passenger, but it's directly evoking the theories of John Wheeler. You know, there are big names in physics from the 20th century. You know, Einstein, John Wheeler, Richard Feynman, Oppenheimer, Hawking, and a lot of especially when quantum mechanics started to become uh, more of a burgeoning field, and people really started going into that, we realized that reality is a lot weirder than we think it is. You know, like time doesn't really exist. There's no actual reason that we have why time flows forward. We don't even know why time moves in one direction, because on the quantum level, it's not even real, honestly. It can work. The equations work just as well going forwards and going back. But there are different mindsets that some of these great minds took towards human existence in the 20th century. Like Stephen Hawking completely just wrote off humanity. You know, he was like, we're just, some pond scum that gathered sentience at some point and became self-aware. It's not anything special. It's just an accident. But John Archibald Wheeler took a very different tact, and he of all the physicists and all the scientists of the 20th century, I think he probably is the man after my heart most, because he was maybe the only one that truly grappled with philosophy as well as science and the way it intersects, in particular what the ramifications for consciousness were. And if you've never seen the his diagram, you can look it up. It's the participatory universe diagram. It's written as a U with the big bang at one end, and then it loops around to an eyeball looking at it. And what Cormac McCarthy says in The Passenger about there not being any such thing as information in and of itself, uh, independent of the apparatus necessary to its perception, is it ties in directly to John Wheeler's theory that as a condition of the universe's existence, it has to be observed. John Wheeler really did believe that consciousness was not an accident, that we as humans are not an accident, that our observance of the universe, our beholding of it, does something fundamental for it. And that it also ties in with idealism in philosophy, like Immanuel Kant, that there is no object without a subject. That if you're not perceiving the tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to hear it. Does it make a sound? If you ask Cormac McCarthy, he'll probably tell you no, it doesn't make a sound. It doesn't even fall. It's not even a tree if no one is around to observe it. And I love that part right there because it was going against kind of the cosmic nihilism of Stephen Hawking. Because Stephen Hawking was just like, we're here, we could die at any moment. We don't serve a purpose in the overall scheme of things. But Wheeler and Cormac McCarthy, I believe, really thought that we do, and that the fact that we exist to behold the universe is really the only reason why the universe itself exists at all itself. And so I just really love that because it really it merged the science and the philosophy seamlessly because you really should read some of Wheeler's thoughts about the participatory universe, that without something to observe it, what's the point? I mean, really, what is the point? If there's nothing to observe something, what's the point of that something? So I love this book because it went there, and it went there with holding nothing back.
The observer effect, I've heard of it. Is that the same concept or is that something different?
What the observer effect? A lot of people take the observer effect to mean. A lot of people kind of run with that to mean that like conscious humans looking at something is dealing with that. But at its heart, the observer effect just means that something exists in superposition. It doesn't actually concretely exist in one specific state until something else interacts with it, until it is forced to be measured against something. Like if you shine a flashlight into space, right, you won't see the light. There's nothing there for the light to illuminate. But if you shine it on, like, an asteroid out there, you see the asteroid because the asteroid is observing the light. Light is observing. So the observer effect is not really dependent on consciousness, but John Wheeler and Cormac McCarthy, by extension, took it further and said that consciousness, we may not know exactly what, but consciousness, it probably does have to exist, that it can't just be an accident. There has to be some reason why we're here, that we do fundamentally do something for the universe. We vindicate it, kind of.
Yeah. Did he ever explain that are humans the cutoff point for that participation?
Or oh, like, no, I doubt we are. Check back in a few million years or so, and who knows what we'll be. Probably won't look at all like what we are now, but information has to be encoded, I think, is what Archibald Wheeler and Cormac McCarthy are saying, that what would be the point of a universe without life? I mean, you have some rocks and stuff. But see, that's the thing, is that McCarthy is known for such a bleak, pessimistic outlook on life. But at its heart, he's very anthropocentric, I guess. He has the anthropic principle meant a lot to him because, and it ties in with his other works. Because if you look at Blood Meridian, he explicitly says in that book that acts have their being in the witnessing of them, that things that aren't seen and beheld. It's no different than them not existing at all, because it's all dependent on the encoding of that information in the conscious mind of whatever is beholding it. Or so I take it. I'm not a physicist, so.
What do you think they mean by what's the point of something? Like what is like, because something can exist without a point. Because I remember I read, I think it was called A Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss, actually.
Yeah, Lawrence Krauss,
many years ago. And I think one thing that a lot of people can't wrap their head around is they say, well, what's the probability of life? It's like, it doesn't matter because it happened, right? Regardless of how improbable life is or all of this is, it happened,
Yeah. It absolutely happened, and it's inevitable, I think, because not only have we learned that, we exist in an infinite universe, we exist in an infinite universe, more than likely just in infinity of infinite universes. And, you roll the dice enough, you're going to get snake eyes at some point. It's not just that it happened. I think it's that it had to happen at some point. It had to happen sometime, somewhere. Because, I mean, I just don't think that without life there wouldn't really be much of a point. Andre Lind has these same theories. He's a Russian physicist as well, and he takes it even farther than Wheeler to say that yes, the universe only exists because we perceive it to exist, which I pretty much second myself. I don't see a point. Lawrence Krauss is much more of the Stephen Hawking persuasion that it's just random occurrence and accident. I'm of the persuasion that there are no accidents, there are no coincidences. I think McCarthy was of that persuasion as well, because I think he really did kind of lay it all out there with the passenger that it's about life, the universe, and everything, as I titled my haphazard review of it as.
So, are there any other elements in the outside of you were talking about entropy and how that relates to the plot, meaning things just are kind of crumbling away to nothing? Are there any other conversations or scenes in this book that you feel are also linked to those concepts, a scientific sort of foundation? Like, because Bobby Western, he's running all around the place, talking to various old friends, having these incredibly interesting conversations, and that's really all they are. It's a weird sequence of events where he's like, oh, I'm gonna have dinner with this guy and talk to him for a while, and but any of those encounters, do you see anything in those that are linking back to this like global, what he's trying to say?
Well, there's one instance, and this is where I think the book was kind of just beaten together, because it was kind of obvious that he was just trying to make up an excuse to put down this scientific information in a fictitious framework. There's one instance where one character, I don't even remember who it was, just stands up and says, "Tell me about physics." I don't even think that character is named, and then they talks about it, and he talks about like gluons, and see, I don't even think that was known in 1980, but he's talking about gluons, and that's when he mentions the information apparatus necessary to its perception. But then he's talking about time and everything like that certain particles may move backwards in time. And yeah, so I think a lot of those conversations were just McCarthy just desperately wanting to talk about the things that interested him. Although there are conversations with the lawyer character in the books towards the end, which weren't scientific, which I found endlessly fascinating. How McCarthy deconstructs the Kennedy assassination, and he proves that it couldn't have been Oswald. And I'm kind of leaning towards that myself, because you can actually see the uncut Zapruder film here on YouTube, and it's age restricted for a reason. But I don't believe a 22 caliber rifle would do to a human head what that rifle supposedly did to Kennedy's, because I've shot my fair share of things with a 22 in my day, and I can tell you it doesn't do quite that. But then again, that's neither here nor there. But I love that scene where he deconstructs that, and there's also a very important conversation that they have about currency and the advent of other forms of currency, like digital currency, which I think everybody should read, because that was, well, I would say it was prescient, but it's really not, because it was just retroactively prescient, but very important stuff either way, I think.
I can't remember the guy's name though. One character really stood out to me that was hilarious. It was some kind of backwoods dude that he was shooting rats or something in his trailer.
Yeah.
Do you remember his name?
Yeah, I can't remember what that guy's name was. That's the one. The book made me laugh too, and that's the one where he was only into like the grannies,
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And he said she looked. I remember that line. It's one of them. He says she looked like a bog person. Those bog people that they brought up out of the Norwegian swamp. That tickled the old funny bone. It did.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's really impressive about Cormac McCarthy is he has these moments of levity, just like batshit humor, crazy stuff.
Yes.
And then these very deep, profound discussions, and in the same book, nonetheless. And what do you think? What do you think his do you think it's strictly like And I don't think he thinks about structure or anything like that or characterization. I think
Oh,
he just writes and this is what it is. But if you had to guess, what do you think his purpose of creating these kinds of characters are? Like, because his characters almost always feel like archetypes. They always feel like they're not just a human, but they're representing something. Do you think it's just it makes him laugh, or do you think there's something deeper there to these crazy guys?
I think it goes pretty deep. Blood Meridian, the judge character in that book, is pretty archetypal. It's kind of a Nietzschean Ubermensch devil type character. But then in like his Border trilogy, he kind of deconstructs our typical conceptions of like the cowboy in American mythology and kind of breaks it down into less glamorous material. But yeah, there are characters all throughout his work that kind of, especially in Outer Dark, that are kind of emblematic of things, I think. But I found the characters in The Passenger to be remarkably human, though, as well. And that's partly also why the book endeared itself to me so deeply.
Yeah. That's one thing for me. Like I am not well versed in philosophy in the slightest, but I can still get a lot out of McCarthy's work. And that's one thing I always think is a great quality to have in a writer, because I'm fine with people having ideas they want to express, but if they're not expressing them within the boundaries of a great story, like it's meaningless to me. Um,
Yeah.
because it seems to me that anytime your ideas are too surface level, you're kind of missing the point of what fiction is. You might as well write a
Yeah.
nonfiction book.
Yeah.
And I'm always
Don't read Gravity's Rainbow then.
no, I have no plans to read that. Yeah,
Save yourself.
it's funny you say that because we're doing a voting on a book club book, and I know that Inherent Vice is the one in the lead right now. But
Oh yeah.
um, what I like to do is I read Cormac McCarthy's books, and then I'll kind of dig around online, or watch people like yourself who have a very much deeper knowledge in these kinds of things than I do, and it just kind of just makes you want to go back and read it all over again. Are there any moments in this book that threw you off, like you didn't immediately see what he was going for, and you had to kind of go off and research on your own to maybe extrapolate more of that?
The entire book threw me off. It seriously did because the tone of it, I did not anticipate because we knew it was probably going to be the ride into the sunset. This was going to be the last hurrah. And I really anticipated the book to be a little bit uh, more lighthearted, not nearly so bleak as the most of his other books are, because you kind of want to go out, leave them something happy. I thought, but it caught me totally off guard because of just how pessimistic this book was. The Alicia character, she's pretty much geared towards suicide. Aren't we allowed to say that on YouTube
Oh
anymore?
yeah, I think so.
I know videos get flagged for saying things like that,
We'll find
but
out.
yeah, here remains to be seen. But yeah, she is. Bobby says that she knew that she was going to kill herself from a young age, and I think the rather dour outlook which the book has is a result of the science of it, because McCarthy was a guy who was obviously very curious about, life and science and math and everything. But the fact of the matter is, and it's touched upon very explicitly in Stella Maris, is that the tools that we have at our disposal for understanding the world around us only ever seem to raise more questions. Like, we have mathematics. We don't know whether mathematics was discovered or invented. Although McCarthy, I believe, in the Lawrence Krauss interview, said that he thinks it was invented, that humans just concocted it. I don't know if I agree with that. But the fact is, we can't even decide on that. Also, like, the very foundation of mathematics is, well, the foundation of mathematics is logic, but the numerical foundation of mathematics is numbers. And we don't even know what numbers are. I mean, we know that they correspond, like counting things, one apple, two apple. But what does it mean if I ask you to give me the negative square root of minus three apple? What does that actually mean? We don't know the tools at our disposal don't help us understand things so much. They just lead down more and more rabbit holes. And I feel like McCarthy was really wrestling with that. It just how much we don't know. Over 100 years ago, Lord Kelvin, who was a scientist, I believe he was a physicist of some sort, and he, back in like 1880 something, he said, "We know everything now. We pretty much discovered it." So, mind you, Hubble hadn't even discovered that the Milky Way is not actually the universe. They said, but Lord Kelvin said, "We know everything now. We've discovered everything. All that remains is just more and more minute degrees of measurement." And that truly is the wrongest that any human has ever been in history. I don't think anybody has ever been that wrong, because what the passenger confronts us with is just how much we don't know and how much we probably can't know. Because even the things that we use to try to understand things are themselves problematic, because we don't even understand the tools. It's like we don't understand the broader things, but even the more specific things we don't understand. And so the book itself caught me off guard because of just how pessimistic it was in its tone, because I really thought it would be happier. But then, especially in Stella Maris, when you know that the suicide is hanging over the whole thing, and the passenger Bobby says that she told him that she never really wanted to be here because it's a rigged game, in other words, that we're kind of just rats in a maze. Despite all our rage, we're still just a rat cage, so to speak. We can't get out because you can't understand it from the inside. I think is what that's the overall thesis of, at least of Stella Maris, is that you can't understand something unless you're on the outside of it. And since we're obviously on the inside of it, it's kind of confounding, and it may not ever be fully known, and it won't be fully known to each individual, because science is just a march of progress, of the march of progress, like the evolution picture fun, but it's a march of progress of people making very small discoveries, which snowball into other discoveries. But the people doing the work die before they can ever understand much of what they're working with, and so at some point in the future we may not have greater knowledge of things, but that won't benefit you or me now. And that's the depressing thing, is that we're just blind to so much. And I just love this book so much because of that, because it all ties back into I think McCarthy's assertion that there may be some thinking thing outside all of it that we're striving towards, and however blindly, such as my surmisal, at least.
Hmm. So, are you saying that you think I don't want to say that Cormac McCarthy had like a religious epiphany at the end of his life, but what do you think he thinks? I mean, I know that's a difficult question to answer, but when you're talking about something else out there that is not necessarily pulling the strings, but that is responsible for everything, do you think he's thinking it's like a force, or like an actual consciousness, like a higher being, or what?
I think, and I don't want to. Well, I mean, he's passed away. It's fair game now. I can say we can
Yeah.
speculate what we want. I believe he was raised Catholic. As a kid, he was a Catholic, and then he eventually fell away from that. And I don't know what his religious beliefs were, but I do believe, based on the reading of all of his books, that he probably did believe in something, some higher intelligence out there, because uh, if you extrapolate it out, like I said with the Wheeler stuff that he really played into about things like in Blood Meridian, acts have their being in the witnessing of them. If there's not, if things can only exist because things are there to perceive that they exist, but things existed before we were there to perceive them exist, then that would sort of seem to imply that there would have to be something, you know, uh, the unmoved mover, as Aristotle might say, that put things there. And I do believe, and this is just me, I might be totally wrong, but I do believe that McCarthy really did believe in something, some kind of higher intelligence, some power, some force that made things move, the prime mover of things. And I think that was kind of what he was alluding to in Stella Maris whenever Alicia described seeing something that occasionally people do get that glimpse beyond. Like the Indian mathematician, I can't recall what his name was, one of the most brilliant mathematicians ever. He said that his mathematical theorems, many of which were not proven and validated until like over 100 years later, he said that all of his stuff came from dreams where he would see the Hindu gods revealing on scrolls these equations. And so I think that McCarthy probably believed something like that. There is something out there from which things come, from which everything comes, and that but it is the questioning of the motives and intentions of that thing, which I think he was principally concerned with, because his rather bleak outlook was all pervading almost.
Yeah. Did you, in any of his other books, did you see glimmers of this kind of just these ideas in past works, or was it just kind of heavy-handed like The Passenger and Stella Maris?
Oh yes, in retrospect, that's also why I love The Passenger so much, because I think it encapsulates pretty much all of his other works. In Outer Dark, there's a conversation between some of the characters about the necessity of language that I think he was dealing with these things in a much more abstract sense in the past, and only recently, when he understood the science of it, was he able to really codify it, um, like professionally, like he did with The Passenger. But in Outer Dark, there's a conversation about um, language and the necessity of language. That if something can't be denoted, if it can't be identified linguistically, then you can't lay claim to it. It's beyond you if you can't even name it, and that's why in the book his names are such important things. Then of course in Blood Meridian, um, there's the acts have their being and the witnessing of them. That's a theme that a lot of people don't pick up on in that book, is that he's saying that things uh, that aren't seen don't really matter. And again, I think that was in much more of an abstract sense in that book, where it's much more scientific and philosophical in The Passenger. And then in The Crossing, if you've ever read that, there's a lot of hyper cerebral philosophizing in that. There's a conversation that talks about things separate from their shapes have no, or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but there's a lot in that book. And then in No Country for Old Men, there's discussion that Sheriff Bell has towards the end of the book about truth, which he compares to the rock, like what's referred to in the Bible, and that truth can't be changed. And what's interesting is that he said you can't change it because it's what you're talking about. The very fact that you have to acknowledge that you have to change it means that it can't be changed. You can only cover it up, but it will always be there. Now, I think all these themes he really pulled together in The Passenger into one big potpourri of uh, madness, perhaps, but interesting madness at the very least.
Yeah, I like how we have a Smashing Pumpkins reference in this, as well
Yeah.
as potpourri. So I think it's the best way to talk about Cormac McCarthy. I guess I'm always fascinated why people believe certain things. I grew up personally in a very religious household. I'm not religious myself any longer, and I wonder. You mentioned that Cormac McCarthy started off as a Catholic and then kind of fell away from that later in life. Do you think that his discovery of the sciences was kind of like, I guess, filling a void that maybe he left behind? And do you think that almost his prior beliefs and the Judeo-Christian religion kind of just brought everything full circle for him, in terms of not that he believed in that specifically, but just that him discovering these things about, oh, there must be some kind of prime mover, as you say, through science? I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's just an endlessly fascinating subject, even separate from McCarthy, because I grew up Arkansas. We're deep in the Bible Belt here. I grew up with a very very literal fundamental interpretation of the Genesis and everything. And as you learn later, of course, that no science verifies any of that. I don't know what your religious background was. You may have been more of a progressive kind of. It was metaphorical, but where I'm coming from, it was very much meant to be taken literally. But then as you grow up and you're like, well, every bit of scientific discovery that we made says that this can't be this way. And I think McCarthy may have had some kind of experience like that because um, I think, like I said, I do believe that he believed in something, but one of the big questions is, does science conflict with religion? And well, if you interpret certain scriptures literally, yes, there's a major conflict. But then again, if you interpret it in a more abstract, metaphorical sense, you can make it work, even if you kind of have to hammer it together. But I believe it was Max Planck, um, the physicist or the scientist, who said that the first steps of science will make you an atheist, but God is waiting at the bottom of the glass or something like that. And I think that's kind of may have been reflective of McCarthy's own experience that, you fall away from it kind of in youth, but then later on, because uh, I don't know if you've read No Country for Old Men, but that is very preoccupied with religion and kind of like a doomsday thing that society just collapses in a very kind of a conservative Christian, because the Sheriff Bell is like a kind of an earthy, good old boy kind of thing, and but his outlook is very much of like an old fashioned kind of conservative Christian outlook, and so I think that was kind of McCarthy groping back to some semblance of design, I guess. And I think The Passenger was him trying to fuse it all together into something cohesive, both the philosophic slash theologic slash scientific aspects of it all, trying to get back to some kind of uh, panorama, I guess.
All right, so since my mom will never watch this, I think it's appropriate to talk about. But as you age, Cormac McCarthy was a very old man when he wrote this, or when he finished it anyway.
Very old man.
And it's very, I don't know, as you near death, right? As you near oblivion, you
Yeah,
start to think more about this stuff, right? You
yeah.
don't have you don't think you're invincible like you are in your youth, and your whole life's ahead of you. My mom is doing the same thing, so I've noticed that while she's always been religious, her religiosity is like at power level 5,000 or whatever right now, because
Oh yeah.
again, I think she's just getting older. She's starting to think about more of this stuff. She obviously wants me to be there with her, at some
Oh
point in
yeah.
heaven.
Mhm.
And do you think that was kind of driving Cormac McCarthy to a degree, even subconsciously? Because I don't know, when you're at the end of your life and you're thinking about, this is it, I'm almost there. Some of the
What comes next?
yeah, exactly. What comes next? And I know he was trying to ground this all in science, but I almost, in some degree, do you feel like that's reaching, because he wants this kind of buttoned up? There is something out there. There is something after this. There is a point. Or do you think he still just was unsure, and this wasn't necessarily a product of him being an old man facing death?
Well, I think his last few books were definitely his old man books, so to speak. No Country for Old Men is the most old man book I think he ever wrote. That was a book very preoccupied with a kind of a downward decline of society, kind of an erosion of conventional morals. And then The Road was, all about fatherhood, and he with his son, very personal. But yeah, I would be not surprised at all if The Passenger and Stella Maris was his grand attempts to try to grapple with the imminence of his mortality. Because I mean, you got to remember, the atomic bomb is a big um, it's a big motif in this book, and you got to remember he was so old that he was 12 when that bomb was dropped. Like, he's one of the last few people that can like remember and comprehend what that meant when that happened. He was old, and he throughout, ever since 1945, we've that doomsday clock, those hands have been creeping closer and closer to midnight. And now with certain um, Eastern European leaders edging closer and closer to maybe using those things, it's definitely not only just for his age, but I think just for the state of the world at large. I think he was very probably preoccupied with endings, because I think The Passenger is a book of endings. I think that's why it kind of just fizzles out. I think it's a book about things coming to a close, relationships, lives, maybe the world eventually. It's a very dour kind of book. But yeah, I think it was very personal for him. I think it was very much a mortality related thing.
Yeah, because it's always interesting to think about. Are people trying to fit the pieces together, or do these pieces actually fit together without them trying to ascribe meaning to them? I think that's always interesting
Very
to
good
me,
question.
because we're just always, we're wired for patterns,
Yeah, yeah,
and Alicia was so damn smart that some of these patterns, and I remember that's another thing that Michael Shermer stated in that book, The Believing Brain, in that they can just see more patterns, these geniuses. That doesn't mean they're all correct. They just
oh
happen to
yeah,
see a broad spectrum of them, and they're able to pluck some of them that are true, right? That actually are true.
yeah,
But then these other things, he gave tons of great examples about how, he'd be at these parties, these scientific conventions or whatever, and he'd be talking to these brilliant physicists, and they'd be mentioning, all this crazy stuff that they're working on. But then on the other hand, they'd be talking about some crazy alien shit that they saw in their backyard. So,
yeah,
it's really funny to think about that, and like, well, what is real? What is, what did Alicia perceive that is true versus isn't true? And same thing with anybody just living today. It's always, because on one hand, you almost discount their genius to a degree, because you're like, wait a minute, I know you thought about this and you have this theory and you mathematically
yeah,
proved it, but you're also batshit crazy.
yeah,
So it's really cool to see that Alicia was depicted in such a way, even though she's a very tragic character, just grappling with. It's almost like she's just confined by her own biology, just like what she's
yes,
given and what the way we perceive, because we can't see everything or feel everything. We just evolved. I mean, depending on what you believe, but evolved in such a way where we're at the point now where we are, our physical nature, our literal biology is falling behind what we
yeah,
can do. Like, everybody wants to rush to space, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of things you're not thinking about, of things that actually literally root us to this earth
yeah.
that
We're
we
not
need.
built to live
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and so it's always funny how I read this story recently on the Ted Chiang story. It's called Tower of Babylon, and it's really about the
Yeah,
Tower of
yeah,
Babel story, and
yeah,
um, just always reaching for something greater. The grass is always greener. There's something else we're always trying to achieve or discover, and that's always fascinating to me. How's like nobody is just happy with where we are. Just as a species, we're constantly like looking up to the stars and wondering what our next
yeah.
move is going to be. Um, I don't know where I was going with all that, but I just it just totally fascinates me to think about that. And I guess later in life, like I've come to appreciate more of what we have and where we are on Earth. And because I remember when I was younger, it was always fascinating to me, like, oh yeah, we're gonna live on space stations or different planets or all that. But then I don't know what it is, but like I've just come to appreciate just literally being grounded and appreciating what is around us already.
Yeah,
But you got guys like Elon Musk who are always just, to the moon and beyond kind of thing.
yeah.
Um,
Up and away.
yeah, yeah. Do you know when he got this just this intense interest with mathematics and sciences? Like when he decided to go and have this, it's residency, right, at the University of New Mexico?
Yeah, I think it was about like what 2005 that he uh, got that seat at the Santa Fe Institute. It was after 2000, I think, and ever since then he's just been plugging away, learning advanced scientific theories to later plug into his books. So I don't think it's been that long.
I did get into McCarthy until even my first McCarthy book was The Road, just because it had such, so much press behind it. I didn't even know who he was at the time when I picked it up, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't appreciate it like I do now. So it was a long time before I really kind of was in the McCarthy world, and I still haven't read nearly all of his work anyway. So I was just curious if you knew maybe like when that happened and how it related to his writing.
Yeah, I think it was in '05 or somewhere thereabouts, early noughties, I think.
What do you think the significance of the Western last name is? Bobby Western and Alicia Western.
I thought about that. That's an odd name. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody named that. I think that was probably just a little tongue-in-cheek kind of jab at his the most of his body of work being of some Western variety, Western, neo-Western, what have you. Um, and also, it could be kind of a reflection of like the Western world that developed, A bombs and all this stuff that we have now that we probably shouldn't, but maybe something like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I did hear some commentary about the name though.
yeah, I think I read something in an early review about Western expansion or something like that. But who knows? Who knows? Like
Yeah.
you could extrapolate information or meaning from that however you want. So I don't know. Are there any other nuggets in this book that you think people are overlooking or that you haven't seen delved into quite enough?
Uh, I think I'm about to hope that thunder's not gonna, the storm not gonna cut out the thing. Anymore? I don't know. There is a line that became one of my favorite lines that I've ever read is whenever they're on a bus. It was back in one of the flashback scenes when Alicia is still alive, and they're on a bus back from Mexico, and she's like asleep with her head in his lap and her hair is spread out, and it says her hair was like gossamer. Period. He didn't know what gossamer was. Period. Her hair was like gossamer. That just right there because I don't even know what gossamer is myself. So I was in the same boat, but I was like that was so poetic and perfect right there. What he said there, one of the best lines I think he's ever written.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't even remember that line, but yeah, that's a beautiful line because it's like your language is funny in that way. So because I love watching film too, and seeing the strengths and weaknesses of the written word versus cinema. And what I love about that sequence, those few lines, is that he's describing something that he doesn't even know.
Yeah.
So he has to use the word.
Yeah.
Well, I guess he doesn't have to. He could use something that feels gossamer. But
Yeah.
I love that he's using a word he doesn't know, but then
Yeah.
repeating it again. So good.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. Cool, man. I think we've kind of exhausted everything, unless there's other stuff you'd like to talk about. I didn't have any other questions. You mentioned the most impactful scenes to you. You went heavily into the sciences, which is amazing. No, it's great. I love it. I mean, that's what I was hoping to get out of this. Like you bring a lot of depth to your book reviews.
I look at the reviews on like Goodreads and Amazon of this book, and I feel like I read too much into it because I'm like, I think I got more out of it than anybody else did. But at least now, like Paul Harvey said, and now at least whoever watches this will know why I do think I have pretty good grounds to say that I think this was his best book. I think it's not the most perfect of his books by a long shot, but I think in terms of its reach, I don't think he ever wrote anything as ambitious as this and as well rounded.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I don't know that it's as accessible, of course, like No Country for Old Men or even The Road.
Yeah.
I would definitely recommend you have a couple of other Cormac McCarthy books under your belt before you delve into this one. I've actually been thinking about going back and reading his books chronologically because there's some gaps in there I have. Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
Oh, I did that at the last year leading up to the release of this book. I went back. I started with The Orchard Keeper, and I went Outer Dark, and then I'd already read Child of God, but yeah, it's a dive I can recommend taking.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's something that I've always been telling myself I should do, just to see how he develops as a writer. And I don't know, maybe I'll find something in there that I like even more than the ones I've read. That's the one thing that has always interested me to see, like, hey, are there other books out there that, because I don't know, books are personal, right? There's definite ones that there's a consensus on, which are, like we're always talking about Blood Meridian being his like magnum opus kind of thing. But I
Yeah,
find that,
people talk too much about that one now, I think.
yeah, I find that just books are so personal is that everybody has a unique experience. They're something you do in isolation, right? You're living with all of these characters, but it's just you experiencing it while you read it. And that's what's always fascinated me about reading is that, if you're watching a movie, you can watch it with somebody else and, turn over and laugh or cry or whatever in their presence, experience it together. Whereas books, it's not quite the same. And so I'm curious to see if there's any other Cormac McCarthy stuff that I'll uncover that might have more impact on me, than the ones I've already read. But I guess before we go, you write books, and Cormac McCarthy is. I started your book. I wanted to just get a sense of it because you were talking about your latest one anyway. You tell me how terrible and depraved and just horrible, disgusting it is, and so I was like, all right, I'm gonna check it out. I read the first chapter and I was like, holy shit, he's right. He's right. But another thing, I'll link it down below too for anybody who wants to check it out. And we were talking offline, like maybe once I do read it, bring him back on and we'll just kind of talk about it because if the rest of the book is anything like chapter 1, there's going to be a lot to talk about.
Oh no, it gets so much worse.
I can't wait.
I do use a quote from The Passenger as an epigraph in my book. Probably the first person to do that. That's how much I love this book. I use it as usually for epigraph material. So
yeah, that's great. Because I did notice there's a lot of McCarthyisms in your writing. That was one thing that really stood out to me outside of the profanity and all the other stuff. But like McCarthy he uses these strange, archaic, like almost compound words that you just don't hear anymore. You don't read anymore. I noticed some of that in your own work. So how is Cormac McCarthy? Would you say he's your biggest influence on your own writing, or?
Oh, without a doubt. I've loved literature for since I was 9, but he was the first one that I was like, if I'm gonna write, I read like some of his books back in high school. I was like, if I'm ever gonna try to be a writer, I want to write like this, because not only is it the archaisms, those ridiculous words that nobody has heard in like 300 years that he uses, but also he uses what's called polysyndeton. I think that's how you pronounce it. Ernest Hemingway used it too. It's the use of the word "and" instead of commas. And what he's doing is it really is scriptural. It reads like scripture. Like you can read the King James Bible, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. That's partly why the Bible is that's partly why the Bible is the book it is, because of the way it's written, because it's written with, it doesn't, they use and the days of his life numbered this, and he begat, and like that. And McCarthy really played into that, and he kind of, Faulkner did it too, but Faulkner didn't do it nearly as well as McCarthy. I think McCarthy took the best of Faulkner and then made it better, because he did that kind of scriptural biblical style writing, but he made it his own, and he made it much more arcane and kind of mystical. And that's really what I've tried to, I guess, shamelessly rip off, or in polite words, emulate. Especially with the first book I wrote, I tried too hard, I think, with that one. And the sentences came out kind of odd. With the first book that I wrote, it was it's written in a very choppy manner, which I didn't realize until I went back and read over it later. I was like, oh, you went too far with that. But yeah, he was definitely I don't think there's anybody who wrote quite like that, except me now, I suppose. But yeah, it's a good thing. His death, while tragic, was fortuitously timed, because his mantle didn't even have a chance to hit the ground before I picked it up. And
Man.
rolling. I'm carrying on the legacy over here.
You might
I
be
need that
carrying the fire, right? You're carrying the fire.
Yes, yeah. There you go. I'm carrying the fire. Yeah, he really is the biggest influence on me because I think it's scriptural writing. It reads like something out of the Bible almost, and I just don't think there's really anybody else that does that, who eschews commas and punctuation like that. So yeah, my stuff may be far more depraved and lurid, but it reads similar, I think. So.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever read anything like Cormac McCarthy's work that I read in your first chapter there of your latest. So you're definitely bringing your own flavor to it for sure. Cool, man. Well, yeah. Thanks for coming on. Why don't you let everybody know where they can?
For having me.
Yeah, of course. Let everybody know where they can find you. I'll drop all the links down below too as well. But
I think we did a pretty deep dive into this. I think I went deeper than I was anticipating going into.
No, there's plenty of times where I was just like, I can't respond because you're talking about things that are way over my head. But I think that's great because I know there's a lot of people, particularly one guy I know who's definitely interested in the philosophical aspects of writing. He really clings to that. And so I think you brought a really good perspective there. Even the sciences too. There's a lot of stuff that you threw at me that I didn't know about. So it's great. I think conversations, I always say, definitely bring out the best in a book. Even though I love doing reviews, I know you do reviews all the time too on your channel, but yeah, it's been great, man. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah.
And like I said, I already mentioned, like, where do you want people to check out your stuff before I let you go?
You mean?
Yeah, like YouTube, Amazon, like any kind of places you want people to go.
The Falcon Reads. Come give a like, subscribe, the old spiel. And then also on Amazon, you can check out Carroll Wainright. That's 2 R's, 2 L's, Wainwright. I've got 2 books out there, the latter of which I'm more proud of. I think it's more polished and refined. But yeah, you can check out Carroll Wainright on Amazon.
Cool. Yeah. Smash the like button.
Ramen noodles.
Yeah, there you go. Cool, man. Well, yeah, thanks again for coming on. And like I said, I think once I get a chance to read your book, which will be very soon, maybe bring you back on and we talk about it. Hopefully, I was thinking about that. I'm not sure if it should be a spoiler-free thing or what. I'll see if it's possible to talk about without spoilers, because we want to get people to read it out there. So
it's more bleak and pessimistic than anything anybody has ever read.
Oh, and like that, the internet connection is cutting him off because
I can say that confidently right now.
Okay, cool. Well, that makes me more excited to read it because I love me some bleak stuff. It looks like he's
the blackest, most pessimistic thing that.
Awesome. Well, I think you're good. It sounds like a storm is coming. It's cutting out his internet, so I guess I'll stop the recording here. But check out all the links down below in the description for all of his work and his YouTube channel, of course, where he talks about all kinds of amazing books nobody's reading. So I think are you back? Are you back? Maybe. All right. I'll talk. Oh wait, there he's moving. I think we have him temporarily. Now he's frozen with jazz hands. All right. Well, that is the dramatic conclusion to this chat of the passenger, I guess. Carroll, thanks, man. Appreciate it again. I know I've said it like 3 times, but it's been a great chat. I think you actually excavated a lot more about this book than I imagined. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Oh, there he is. All right, for the last thing. Okay. With a prayer hands, please. The internet connection. Stay on. All right. Thanks, everybody.